Good morning. Hey. Good morning to the board members and executive director of Master Builders South Africa, the panelists and presenters, stakeholders, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Master Builders South Africa webinar, From Policy to Practice, Improving Disaster Readiness on Construction Sites. I am Vikashni Harbhajan, the Executive Director of Master Builders KwaZulu-Natal, and I join you today in my capacity as the Chairperson of the MBSA National OHS Committee and as an MBSA board member. And it is my absolute pleasure to serve as your Program Director for this webinar. The question we should all be asking ourselves this morning is, if a construction emergency occurred on site today, how ready and equipped would we be to respond effectively? This question lies at the heart of today's webinar, themed From Policy to Practice, Improving Disaster Readiness on Construction Sites. Recent construction incidents in South Africa remind us that safety systems, emergency preparedness, and regulatory compliance are not simply administrative requirements. They are essential mechanisms for protecting lives and ensuring the sustainability of our industry. Now, this webinar takes place at a particularly important moment for the construction industry in South Africa. Recent building collapses have once again reminded us in a very, very sobering way that construction safety and disaster preparedness cannot be treated as theoretical exercises. These are matters of life, responsibility, and professional accountability. So our objective today is to actually bridge the gap between regulatory policy and practical implementation. This webinar aims to strengthen disaster readiness in the construction sector by reflecting on construction-related disasters, emergency preparedness, compliance requirements, and the role of technology, resources, and leadership in improving readiness across the industry. This webinar also offers CPD points from SIOSH. Thank you to Niels Norkia. So we encourage you to remain with us for the duration of the program. We also have an outstanding lineup of speakers, and I am confident that today's discussions will provide valuable insights for all our participants. Without further ado, let us move into the program. And please join me in welcoming Roy Mnisi, the Executive Director of Master Builders South Africa. Roy is an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa, and he currently serves as the chairperson of the JBCC board. This morning, he joins us to deliver the official MBSA welcome and opening address. Please welcome Roy Mnisi.
Thank you very much, Program Director and Chair of the Master Builders South Africa Occupational Health and Safety Committee, Ms. Vicky Harbhajan. I also want to acknowledge the presence of our Vice President, Mr. Mark Fugart, MBSA immediate past President, and the President of Construction Alliance South Africa, Mr. Musa Shangase, as well as all presidents and executive directors of our associations present here. To our esteemed guests and speakers, I welcome all of you and thank you all for making time to share your expertise with us today. To all members of our associations in attendance, I'd like to welcome all of you to yet another important webinar under the carefully selected theme, From Policy to Practice, Improving Disaster Readiness on Construction Site. The recent state of building collapses in various parts of our country have had excuse me, have had far-reaching consequence for our industry. This situation does not only call for our introspection as an industry, but necessitates serious consideration for safety of our employees and all other people who come into contact with our work as builders. This webinar is one of those efforts aimed at achieving that particular goal. This webinar will also help us to reflect on our status of readiness when disaster strikes. Are all role players ready to respond to incidents of disaster? I have just learned that some of our municipalities do not have functioning emergency services to respond to life-threatening events, fires, medical emergencies, and rescue operations that may be required from time to time. These are many reasons why things go. There are many reasons why things go wrong. Let us agree that one of those reasons is non-compliance. Compliance in the construction industry is critical for ensuring worker safety, legal adherence, project quality, just to mention a few. Our panelists are going to help us understand this better. At the end of this session, we are going to be in a better position to know why compliance matters. I would like to quote one of occupational health and safety specialist, Paul Kozas, who once said, open quote, managing compliance takes resources, but is nowhere near expensive as the cost associated with such breach, close quote. I am sure we all agree with that. Ladies and gentlemen, you are all welcome to this webinar, which I believe will help us to better understand the state of our readiness as the industry and as a country to respond to issues of emergencies as we proceed with our work as the construction. Excuse me, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, you are all welcome to this webinar, which I officially declare open. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy, for that very warm welcome and for setting the tone for today's important discussion. Before we proceed to the first presentation this morning, just a quick note about the process that we will follow today. So after each presentation or panel discussion, we will allow time for a Q&A session. So please type your questions in the chat function, and we encourage you to participate actively in the Q&A session. Now, while we try to address as many questions as possible, please bear with us if time does not allow us to cover all the questions. Ladies and gentlemen, we are reminded that the construction industry operates within a complex environment of regulation, professional responsibility, and public trust. So globally, construction remains one of the most high-risk industries. International labor statistics consistently show that construction accounts for a significant proportion of workplace fatalities. So, interestingly, I read that it was assessed that the George building collapse represents an anatomy of a failed system, citing regulatory fragmentation, siloed government operations, and weak monitoring mechanisms in the built environment as contributing factors. Now, this leads us to our first presentation this morning, and we are privileged to have with us Richard Benneker. Richard is a professional civil engineer, and he began his career at Clifford Harris, working on road and bridge construction projects, before moving into design, specializing in construction methods and temporary works. He later continued his work with Basil Reed and then established Richard Benneker Designs, where he has completed hundreds of temporary works design projects for major contractors across South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richard Benneker, who will cover reflection on disaster readiness in construction. Over to Richard.
I don't get any feedback, but I assume that you can hear me.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Please proceed.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Richard. If you could just continue.
All right, I will continue. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. As you probably realize, we've had technical challenges, and so I'm having to do this presentation by speaking on my cell phone without all the resources that I had planned. The first comment that I have, and I've got a lot of points that I wish to make, which are not necessarily, you must not necessarily think that what I say is always correct. People are welcome to disagree with me, and much of what I say is intended to simply stimulate our thinking, to apply our own minds to the question of how we anticipate and deal with construction disasters. First of all, we need to have a clear thinking of what we mean by disaster in this context. We use the word disaster quite loosely. Now, we might be on our way to an important interview and we stop to buy a hamburger and we get tomato sauce on our shirts and we say, oh, it's a disaster. That's not the kind of disaster we're talking about. We're talking here in this seminar about disasters that are concerning human life, loss of property on a large scale. So we're not talking about things that just cause personal embarrassment, but we're talking about things that cause real injury and damage. In construction, we have a large number of possible disasters, and I'm going to mention some of them. I think we're all very conscious of structural collapses recently, but let's expand our thinking to include other things. For example, hot weather, extreme hot weather, or other types of weather events can be a disaster in construction, depending on the circumstances where we are working. We sometimes dismiss hot weather as being a real problem because we live in a hot country and we imagine, well, we can all cope with the hot weather. But extreme heat and heat exhaustion is a real medical risk, and it needs to be properly managed. We need to include that in our thinking of what is a disaster. Another aspect is that of poisoning by various means. If you imagine that one is working at a chemical plant and there's a which is poisonous, and that sort of risk needs to be managed. Construction is always a risk of fire. And if we think back to the recent events in Hong Kong where bamboo scaffolding was used on some high-rise buildings, and the bamboo scaffolding was then clad with plastic sheeting to protect the workers and the work from the weather, the plastic sheeting was highly flammable. Almost all plastic sheeting is flammable, and we commonly use that in construction. And when the plastic sheeting caught alight, it burned sufficiently long and hard that the bamboo then caught fire. Bamboo does not burn that easily by itself, but the heat caused the bamboo to catch fire. It became a major disaster. Many people in the scaffolding and in the building were killed as a result of that. Another risk that we don't often think about in construction in this country is the risk of war. But we know that the international politics is extremely unstable, and that's something we need to keep in the back of our minds, the risk of war. I'm just continuing to give lots of examples just to get our thinking going. South Africa, we have the problem of construction mafia. And I have spoken to construction colleagues who have told me of incidents on their sites where a busload of people armed with semi-automatic weapons arrived on site and demanded that the site be stopped. Now, there were no injuries in the cases that I heard about, but if there were to be something that escalated the confrontation between the people employed by the mafia to stop the construction site and the people managing the site, if that level of anger and disagreement had escalated, it could have been a major construction disaster. Some other things that we don't necessarily think about, for example, accidents from the air, such as an aircraft crash or drone attack, working in certain types of construction sites, working with water projects, a burst in a pipeline or a dam collapse is a major risk. Many of our construction contractors work on mines tailing dams, and we all know that tailing dams can collapse catastrophically. We had our own collapse in South Africa many years ago when the Mary Straits Dam in the Free State collapsed. That was not while it was under construction, but we also know about the tailing dams such as in Brazil that have collapsed while they were being used, and that was a huge risk. And the tailing dam collapse is a form of an avalanche. Many of us work on sites where we're in an excavation or on a hill slope, and risk of things falling down, rolling down the hill is a risk. I'm currently involved in the project in the Sutu building the Polihali Dam, and one of the measures that are taken on site there is to build barriers along the slopes of the dam at strategic places to catch any rocks that we should roll down during the construction. And so the list could go on. We only have to look at our newspapers and imagine, could any of these things happen on a construction site? And then obviously to get to the things that we're very much aware of in construction, being the collapse of our temporary work structure. Unfortunately, these types of things seem to happen very frequently, either the collapse of the temporary works or the collapse of the permanent work. And I will deal with that a little bit more later. Maybe unfortunately, I don't have all my pictures and diagrams available now, but we can talk about that later. So what is the probability of an event taking place that collapses the structure? Think back to how an engineer designs a structure. An engineer designs a structure with a safety factor, and a temporary works designer designs it with a safety factor. Think about what is the point of the safety factor. It's not just to make us feel comfortable. It's to cover the real risks that are likely to happen. So in design, we look at the statistical variation in the load. In the case of casting concrete on a deck, we can look at the thickness of the concrete deck multiplied by the density of the concrete to give us a load. But there are other things that happen which may increase that load, such as concrete being discharged from a bucket and arriving in a big heap. And that heap obviously increases the load per square meter way beyond what the thickness of the slab would be. And it takes a while for that heap to be distributed. So part of our safety factor is to cover the probability of that heap of concrete. And there could also be a miscommunication, for example, between a concrete pump operator and the people who are working on the slab, which could result in far too much concrete being placed on the slab. That is a risk, and these things do happen. So the safety factors and the ordinary person thinks of a safety factor as being the difference between what will cause the structure to collapse and what actually on the structure, and if we think there's a big margin, we feel comfortable. But in engineering terms, we don't always treat that as a comfort factor. We treat it as basically a statistical probability of the load being greater than the nominal load. In the case of lifting a heavy object, for example, lifting it with a crane, we spin the object from the crane and we assume that the load is equally distributed between the swings. But that object might slip and rotate, or it might be have unequal mass, and there will be more load on one side than the other. That again causes a distance between our calculated load and the actual load. We also have to remember that the materials that we use to support our structures can have strengths which are vastly different from what we assume. In the case of steel wire rope springs, we are usually fairly confident of the strength of the wire rope, provided it's been inspected and it's in good condition. In the case of a steel beam, we normally have good confidence that the steel beam will have the strength that we expect. In the case of a timber beam, the strength is highly likely to be variable. And that again is one of the factors that we use in engineering design. So to use the formal method that's used in engineering design these days, we talk about limit state design, where we have one factor to describe the probability of the load being what we anticipate, and we have another factor to take account of the strength of the material. And so that makes the design a little bit complicated for our old pattern, let's call it codes of practice. For example, in the Machinery and Occupational Health and Safety Act, in the machinery section, it talks about safety factors on screens. But in modern engineering, we don't just work with a single safety factor. We divide it into a factor for the load and a factor for the material, and we multiply these two together. So going back to the timber example, a timber beam could have a load, a strength rather, which is up to about 2.5 times different, either 2.5 times stronger or 2.5 times weaker than the nominal strength of the timber. Because timber is a natural material, it's highly variable. And so we have to take account of that in our design. And so what I'm trying to say is that designing simply works, designing permanent works is not just a simple matter of saying, what is our safety factor and is it safe? Because things don't work quite differently. Real life is much more complicated than some of our simple examples. To take a recent example where I was involved, the building that collapsed in George really had structural problems. And in my assessment of what might have gone wrong, I found that there were some cases where the strength of the structure appeared to have been exceeded well before the building fell down. And I tried to understand what caused that. And I then realized that the design codes that we use have additional safety built into them. They assume a certain basic analysis of the structure, and we design our structures on the basis of that design code, and we arrive at a quantity of steel and a quantity of reinforcement to put into a slab. But in real life, the strength of the slab might be a lot greater or might be a lot less, because our design method our method of calculating bending moments and shear stresses are actually very simplified. And so part of the factors that we use in design are to account for the difference between what really happens and the simplified answers that we get from our design calculations.
Sorry, Richard, if you could just wrap that up. You have a minute to go, please. Thank you.
I had lots of extra examples that I wanted to share. So I think that I will hand back to the person organizing the seminar, and I will wait for more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for that presentation, and apologies to all the delegates for the technical challenges. And in the interest of time, it's almost 10:40. We will be skipping the Q&A session for this presentation, and I think it's going to be challenging to get the questions across to Richard. So, ladies and gentlemen, one of the consistent lessons emerging from construction incidents worldwide is that many disasters are actually preventable. So disaster readiness, therefore, begins long before work begins on site, okay? And it starts with proper design, planning, coordination, and leadership. And it is not only about responding when something goes wrong. It is about anticipating risks before they materialize. Investigations often point to recurring factors, and the real challenge remains consistent implementation on site. Now, our next presentation focuses on the tools and systems that support disaster readiness. So understanding risk is one thing, but organizations must also have the equipment, the technology, and the resources that are required to respond effectively. We need to be more equipped to save lives in the event of a building collapse. It is therefore my pleasure to introduce Professor Kahilu Kajimo Shakantu from the University of the Free State. Her research focuses on construction management, procurement, and property development. Prof holds a PhD in construction economics and management from the University of Cape Town, and she also serves as the editor-in-chief of the built environment journal Acta Structilia. Please welcome Professor Kahilu Kajimo Shakantu. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you, Program Director. Let me just share my screen. Thank you so much for having me this morning. I'm just quickly going to share my screen now. Oh, actually, it's sharing.
Thank you, Prof. We can see your screen. Thank you. Prof, if you could please unmute.
There we go. Thank you so much. All right. So in improving disaster readiness on construction site, I'm focusing on the equipment, resources, and technology for disaster. Why does readiness matter really in construction? If we think of construction sites are highly dynamic and highly risk environment. And I think we have it on record. When we look at other industries, construction industry is probably the second industry to defense that kills its workers. And there are so many risks on site. I think my previous speaker did mention some of those risks that you find on site. There are fires, explosions, it could be structural collapses, you get excavation accidents, machine failure, extreme weather. There are floods with climate change now, you find there are floods, there's high temperatures, there are hurricanes, and not even to think about the wars and other things. So it's a highly risk environment. And therefore, it means any delays in response to any of these will increase the injuries, it increases the fatalities, and of course, also the bottom line in terms of the project finances, there's a risk of a lot of losses. So it's very, very important then that we are prepared, because preparedness will save lives and it also reduces the downtime on some of these things. So disaster readiness is really moving from documentation and compliance to daily operational practices. How do we make these be part of our daily practices so that it's all about change as well, even in the mindset as well as the culture? Because we can have a lot of these on paper. If I go to my next slide, you will see here, which I won't really go a lot into because the panel discussants will come and talk about these who are experts in that. But just here to show the context as well in terms of we have the regulation. So it's debatable whether the regulation is not sufficient, or that is another debate. But we do have regulatory foundations with the the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the regulations, which really document key requirements that are needed on sites in terms of your risk assessment, in terms of having plans, in terms of the emergencies. But we find that there's a gap in terms of that policy and actually how it translates on the ground, in terms of the implementation, which sometimes there's no enforcement or it's inconsistent. Maybe there are no supervisors, the communication. It's just like in any organization, you can have so many documentation and people will be surprised. You can work in an organization for 10 years and you'll be surprised when somebody tells you about a certain document because you've not even read it. So having regulations is one thing, implementation is another. So what we're saying is regulations are only as effective as the implementation. So when we don't implement them, they cannot be effective. I think during this whole webinar, we'll be hearing references to recent collapses of buildings in South Africa that we've had, the George Building in Johannesburg, in the Eastern Cape, KZN. There are quite a number of lessons that we learned from all those things in terms of what is happening, how ready are we, or how can we get ready. A few things I just wanted to highlight here. A couple of things in terms of structural oversights and failures, because they teach us a few things to say structural oversight must be continuous. Yeah, we cannot leave it. It's something we do today, we do after a couple of days. It has to be continuous. There are things about worker accountability also that we've learned from these cases. It's very, very important to account for each and every person who comes to site, all the workers, so that when we have a disaster, for example, we have a problem, we come to even prevention, we need to know how many people were on site. Was it 100 people? Was it 200? Are we looking for 10 people? So that already sometimes, not even knowing who's on site, poses a challenge in our rescue efforts when a disaster happens, yeah? So keeping accurate records of workers on site, and I think it will also lead when I talk about maybe digital access and control of workers, but basically getting to know who is on site. It's just not the worker, it could be subcontractors, could be anybody who comes to site. So we also found out a couple of things then about just ensuring that safety compliance, early warning is very, very important. Because normally we are reactive, knee-jerk. Something happens, it has happened, it was an accident, want to respond to it. But what we're saying is let's be a bit more proactive than reactive. Let's prevent. How do we prevent? How do we plan? What tools can we really use to foresee, maybe to anticipate? Because that also builds in then our capacity to respond, to recover, and also to build resilience in terms of future things like that. So I think some of it will come in the questions and discussions. So that is just the highlight on that, saying those were important things that we needed, that we also learned from some of those other cases. And then having given that context from the regulation, why it's important, some of the things that we're learning, and there are a lot more lessons that we learned. I've just touched on those three as we're saying, but there's a whole lot of other lessons that we've learned before in terms of coordination, but maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk to them as well towards the end of the slides. But now when we also think about, like I said, mine, I'm also focusing on the resources, the people, the material, and all those things, the equipment that we have on site. So we look at the availability and the management, for example, of emergency equipment. Yeah, because we are planning. Part of the planning is, suppose this happens, how do we deal with it? In that planning, we want to prevent it. Prevention is better than cure, but sometimes you may not prevent something. No matter how much you've planned, something somewhere is going to happen that will deviate from the plan. So should you have then this occurrence, how do you go about? So looking at equipment, some of it actually just starting from the basics. Just starting with the very, very basic equipment that needs to be on site to just make sure that we have the relevant equipment that we need and things are flowing. Fire extinguishers. You'll be surprised, they look very basic. Sometimes it's a small fire. Like we said, remember the site we said there could be fire explosions, there could be explosion fires. It could be something small that can cause so much havoc because we let a little spark just continue. So fire extinguishers, do we have them? Are there any fire suppression systems on the site? First aid stations? Do we have any trauma kits if anything like that happened? Rescue equipment. They could seem basic, but they're very, very, very important. Stretchers, harnesses, tripods. These are things that we want to make sure we have on site. How about emergency lighting? Do we have backup if something happens? Emergency alarms, evacuation systems. So all these are equipments that we need to have around so that we are well, at least we prepare ourselves, we are ready should such things happen. But you find implementation still it's a challenge because we need this equipment to be site specific. And with all due respect, we have a lot of people coming in construction. Maybe somebody was a hairdresser. They decide, okay, now I'm done with hairdresser. I need to go do something else. They come in construction. They might come with the equipment that they used in their previous trade. So you might find the type of equipment we're having on site are not really the equipment that we need. So that needs to be checked to make sure when we are on site, whether our previous trade was hairdresser, we're not going to bring a hair blower there and things like that. So we need to make sure the equipment that we have is site-specific equipment. Are they well maintained as well? And where are these equipment? Because it's one thing to have something. It might be hidden. It might be in a place that when we have a situation, nobody can access them. So the issues of making sure there's proper placement of these equipment, they are visible to people or to everybody. There are regular inspections. Are they working? How regular do we check? Are they maintained? Because it's also pointless to have all these equipment. The day we need them, they're not working. So the regular checking is important. And of course, we have to train the users, to train the trainers and then train the workers as well. Because if you have equipment which people do not know how to use in an emergency case, we're going to have a problem. So effective equipment management is very, very important. And we have to create equipment plans. Do we have a plan of our equipment? And do we have attach it to any risk profiles? Are there regular inspections? And making sure that all this equipment is maintained for us to be able to use them when we don't need to use them. Yeah. So having said that, we just carry on and think now we have, because we're talking about readiness, being ready to prevent. So when I come and talk about the technology that we could use, but we're also looking at, should this happen, how do we still move in terms of helping with the rescue? Because rescue and recovery preparedness on site is just as important. If something happens, how ready are we? First of all, that it should not happen. Second of all, if it has happened, what do we do? How do we minimize the loss? How do we minimize the damage? That is about recovery as well. And what do we learn from that so that we can document it to prevent any future, or at least the way we can deal with future similar incidences. So a couple of things also there in terms of thinking about, do we have emergency response plans on our site? Are they site-specific emergencies? Because remember, we started with talking about the different risks. So the plan could be generic, but obviously you're going to adapt it. If it's a fire, it's going to be tweaked to make sure that your responses tailor to that. If it's collapse, you're also going to do that. So you have the generic, but you're going to have them also then tailored to the specific risks that or incidents that is occurring at that time. So you have these plans that can document the procedures and things like that, but make sure they're also communicated to the people. As a point we're making, let's not just draft these, keep them there, or save them somewhere where nobody. Have regular check-ins where people, can do all these to make sure there are drills. People can do drills. We can do simulations just to make sure that we're improving even our response should these incidences happen. So on-site training teams, especially for large sites, that's very, very important to have that in place. And we, like I mentioned from the George and other collapses that we've had, to ensure we've got a system that has work accountability. POPI Act and what, those are other things, but we need, whether we're using digital or using whatever system, but we have to put in place a system where we can account for the people on site. As well as when we talk about post-incident recovery, how do we secure a site? What do we do? Who does what? Supporting the workers. So all these are things we need to think about and ensure that we are focusing on it. We are preserving. If there's any evidence for investigation that needs to take place, it is well preserved. And for that to happen, we need to make sure the roles are clear. We've clarified the responsibilities and the roles. Who does that? Where does it go? And we've got all that mapped out. And to be able to do that, it means the leadership issue is also very, very important, because there has to be strong leadership for all these things to happen. And culture is important, because at the beginning we said we want to move from just documentation, moving into practice. So the culture, the mindset, if it becomes part of what we want to do, then we find that it moves things a lot better. Okay, so we look at those things, but we also think, yes, technology is very, very important. We look at this thing, it doesn't look like it's technology, right? But actually it is giving a message in terms of these whole coordinations, how things would go, and how even the technology that we're talking about need to be human-centered. How is the technology that can interface with human beings that we could use? And we talk about technology at different levels, because we have to be aware of your grade 1, grade 2, grade 6, grade 5, what kind of technology is available. How is our old technology? Can it interface with the new? So we talk about technology. We're cognizant of the costs involved and other issues around, but we have to talk about it, because we're in this age where we can't just not do technology. Yeah, but of course we have to think about it depending on the age of where we are in that, right? So when we talk about technology, basically we're saying, yes, technology, there's so much potential. And if we want to prevent, technology can do better than the human beings. We can have sensors to detect some of these things we're talking about, that we didn't see the structural failure is about to happen, a crack is starting somewhere. But when you use technology, it helps us then to be able to detect the early warning detection that we're talking about, so that we can have timely interventions. There's so much technology that is coming on the market, but I think we're not investing a lot in it because there are issues of cost, which I think maybe we will come up. Of course, there are issues of cost that we're aware about, but we can start even with some of the small, okay, I would call relatively small in terms of investment, in terms of the capital, wearable devices, in terms of maybe the helmet, that are able to do tracking, to track the workers, to improve accountability, to be able to locate individuals on site. How about digital safety management platforms that can streamline our hazard reporting, that can help with incident investigation, can help with corrective measures and tracking? So there's a whole lot of, and alerts, because we want to be alerted. We don't want to wait until, say, for example, there's a worker doing something, waking up, until they fall and they're in a difficult situation. We want something that will let us tell us to say, you know what, I think in 5 minutes, if this person keeps doing this, they're about to break the back, because then you can also make real-time decisions that can save not only lives, but also bank balance, as it were. So program director, I'm not sure how I'm doing on my time. So there's a whole lot on technology. A lot of it even beyond my scope. People are doing PhDs all over on BIM, and they're doing AI, just a lot, cloud management. So I'm not going to touch into all those because we can take a whole day on it, but just to highlight, the point is just to highlight and say technology is going to enhance safety if we use it, and we want to use technology without the fear of it's going to replace us, because I think we are past that debate of saying it will replace. Like somebody said, even AI or technology, it's not AI that is going to replace you, but it's the person who's able to use AI ethically and effectively is the one who's going to replace you. So just to think about investing, exploring some of these technologies, because they're able to reduce human error, which we know in most cases is an issue that leads to some of these disasters or health and safety issues on site, to be able to improve our decision making on site. We also want to get real-time data monitoring. Like we say, some of us say, in God we trust, but everybody else bring data. You can't just tell me something on data. So we want to make decisions that are data-driven, that are evidence-driven. Yeah. So a lot of technology can help us improve our communication on site, reporting, risk identification, all those issues that we want to have before an incident happens, before the disaster hits us. We can use technology to help us in doing that. Basically, that is the point on these next 3 slides. All of them, basically, they're all just talking about the different technologies that we could be exploring in terms of the wearable helmets. And hopefully these helmets, since they're coming with a lot of technology, I'm hoping even the design, the gender aspect of it will also come. But that's another debate in terms of the PPEs and thinking about the gender component of them. But this looks like it can fit even with hair that is fashioned in a certain way. But anyway, that is besides the point. But wearables like smart helmets with biometric trackers, they monitor the signs. You can detect a worker, like we're saying, falling in real time, so that real-time decisions are taken. Technology in terms of drones, robotics. In the Western, a lot of their research, a lot of their practice is going. We're not at that level yet, but there are few things that we can already start implementing. We don't have to implement, go in big, but there are certain things that we can start investing, certain projects that we can already start seeing how some of these things, because others are already using. And I'm saying this because I'm aware of us having this, the grade 2s and grade 3s all the way up to grade 9. But when we present it here, we present it generic, because yes, there's some who are already using the drones. We're using robotics. We're talking about digital twins. We're able to do simulations, to visualize things, to be able to twin the site so that we can see even areas that we cannot access, even if it's for construction, it's for facilities, it's for management. So it's just talking about, yeah, technology we can invest because it's a cost. Then we'd have to weigh what is the return on this investment, us in using it and us not using it. When a disaster strikes, what is the cost? What if we prevented it? Are we saving? So those are cost-benefit analysis as well that we can look at. And the cost, like we're saying, is not just in terms of saving 500, because we might be saving a whole lot more if we think about it in the whole bigger scheme of things. So in terms of technology, like I said, we can look at augmented reality, which is there, the virtual, all this in terms of trying to give us better scenarios so that we're better prepared of how we could respond and how we could prevent even things happening on site. Yeah. Complementary technologies, like I was saying, there's just a whole lot. So if there are questions, we can get into those so that I can just get through my slide. Program director, I've got 3 remaining. But this 4th one is also, like I've already talked about, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, because then it helps you to be proactive. That is the bottom line. It helps you to be proactive so that you can make a decision now before, rather than the status quo normally, which is it has happened, this building has collapsed, let's start running around and trying to do things. But we are saying, let us invest, let us use tools that are there that can help us to do predictive analysis, to be able to see what are the risks, how can we prevent them, what can we put in place, what kind of decisions can we take right now. If we had an AI-powered dashboard, for example, the site manager gets the information, relays it to the other things that are happening as you are moving and not after the fact, which often, as we know, like in many things, when you have to do a repair, you have to change things, of course, it's going to cost us more than if we had prevented it. So these are some of the things that we're saying we could use in terms of technology, but of course, using it in a way that the human is at the center of it as well. Yeah. And an important thing, so we've looked at the resources, the equipment, the technology, but the coordination. How do we coordinate emergency services? I think the program director talked about where you find even the municipalities and other parties that want to rely on, they might also not be in a very good position to help us. And that's why engaging them now before we have disasters becomes very, very important, because we start developing these plans together. We start working together in terms of what do we need, because we've learned from this case that this is what happens. Can we start maybe putting in measures in place, resources in place for such? But it's like sometimes nobody's talking. Everyone is working independently in silos. So now you can imagine, even when there's no disaster, each person is working independently. Now we have a disaster on our hands. How do we come together and work together? There's no collaboration. So we need to start to be proactive before these events happen, building strong relationship with the fire services, the medical, the disaster, anybody who's working in these places, so that we ensure that things are going well. Just to give an example, I'm speaking from the university. We are in construction, quantity surveying, and property, but we have like a sister unit that is actually DIMTech. They do disaster management, recovery. So it's collaborating with such units already. If you come together, you work with them, they tell us what they do for construction, I think we'll be getting way ahead than if we work in silos, each unit, each profession. There's nothing like that. When the disaster hits, it doesn't know any boundary of any, this one is registered with this profession, that one. So we still have to work collectively together. So yeah, and the proactive safety culture, like I've indicated before, continuous training, leadership engagement, worker participation to foster risk prevention, because we cannot leave anybody out. If we do so, we are already sabotaging ourselves. So how do we close this gap that we're saying, yes, there's a gap? And there are many ways. There's no single way you can close the gap, because it has to be multi-stakeholder, different perspective, different values coming in. But one of the problems is that there's limited documentation, for example, of good practices in disaster recovery, especially here in South Africa. We've got case studies, I'll tell you, maybe India, this place and that place, but we don't have much of this here in South Africa. So that is a gap. Yeah. A lot of the lessons that we learn, we find maybe they are here and there, they're informal, it's case by case, it's not really well documented, and for us to be able maybe to communicate it properly on platforms that can reach many people out there. So we need to start, first of all, even doing that in terms of the partnerships that we've talked about with the industry, with the government, the municipalities, the public sector, everybody coming on board, because we're all stakeholders. For the university, partnerships with industry, regulators, emergency services, academia, like we're saying, it will highlight that evidence-based knowledge is really critical to this proactive disaster readiness. Yeah, because there are gaps there that need to be met. So how do we ensure that we're moving together as a collective to build this resilience that we're talking about? National scoping studies, because some of this information we're finding it, but maybe it's just this article that somebody has written that you come across. Let us carry out nationwide national scoping studies where maybe we can document some of these best practices. What are the lessons that we've learned from these incidences? Really, can we develop best evidence-based disaster prepared frameworks maybe, and how to implement it. Can we pilot these things? So when we talk about readiness, it's not just each person coming and saying, oh, on my site, I'm ready, because they're only speaking on that day when they're called. Is it there documented for others maybe to refer to? Can we create guidelines for this in terms of on the site, and also supporting the training and the capacity? Because like we've said, we cannot be ready if we not working together. So readiness will require all parties coming together and just ensuring that we are moving from the theory, from the documentation, just be there, but really and compliance, but doing it because it's the best thing to do, it's the right thing to do, and it's the most, right thing to do, as it were. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for that impressive presentation, as always. Indeed, I think in God we trust, and everyone else must bring data so we can move towards data-driven decisions. Thank you for that, Prof. We're now going to move into the Q&A session. So delegates, please feel free to type your questions in the chat function. In the interest of time, I will allow a maximum of about 5 minutes for the session. So I'm going to take questions in the chat function, please. Seen lots of comments, but no questions. Yes, we have the first question from Lebokang. What are the strategies and interventions to eradicate unethical conducts in the health and safety space? Prof, can you respond to that?
Sorry, just come again. What's the question? What was the question?
What are the strategies and the interventions to eradicate unethical conducts in the health and safety space?
Oh, I see now that is another topic for another day.
Yes.
Because now we've gone unethical. So I'm not sure if you want me to open up that box.
Do you have maybe a quick response in terms of directing this question?
Okay, yeah, because if we think about it, even when I was talking about us first thinking about developing the culture, the mindset, the leadership, because even ethics, we always even have these debates, even just at this level saying, can you teach ethics to anybody? That is the debate out there, whether you can actually teach ethics. So mostly what we have is like, yes, there are all these issues that, okay, compliance, if you don't comply, we'll punish you this way. And we don't know how well that is working. I'm not saying those things must not be there, but I think policy alone or legislation alone, like we've seen in most things, they do not work. They will not prevent somebody unless the cost really is so high. So we have to have strategies and solutions that are multi-layered, that are coming with different perspective, not just punishment in terms of maybe you're going to pay so much because you're unethical, but let's also try to bring in maybe other perspective where people can see why we should not be engaged, what is the cost of engaging, and why we should not engage into activities like that. And I think if we come in with different multiple or angles, then we'll be able to solve this problem, because I don't think there's one solution to it. So we would have to really sit down and, like I said, with the different stakeholders, each one bringing something to the table in terms of how we can deal with both the carrots and the stick and other things in between.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. The next
and that's
question
without talking about technology. Yeah.
Okay,
thanks.
Thank you. The next question from Neil Inslin is, how can contractors improve communication with emergency responders during a crisis? So we're talking about the link between the contractor and those that respond to emergencies.
Okay, so like I said, part of it already on the side, whether it's the contractor, the subcontractor, the main contractor, on the part of the contractor, you already need to start developing your, say, disaster plans and recovery plans. So part of that actually requires you then to identify in your area, going within the area, the nearest, the furthest, who are the emergency partners and people that can assist when we have these different kind of emergencies. So we develop a relationship with them. We need to have the contact number somewhere where we can get hold of them when we have this emergency. So already part of your plan should include that, so that we have the contact persons, the contact numbers, we have that protocol of who contacts who does that, so that when we're in that situation, and everybody should know. So it's not just something that, like I said, you have this contact number, you just leave it there. So you must have these active, regular drills and regular simulation activities to remind people, because then the more you remind people who they should go to, how they should approach them, when such a thing happens, the people know where to run to in a flash. Because we want to respond in a minute when a disaster happens. We don't want to respond in hours, because that will be too late. So we have to be proactive ourselves.
Thank you, Prof. And
Thank
then
you.
we have a question that I think questions are just coming in here. Why don't we have our own access control procedures or policy for construction? Prof, I don't think that you're going to be able to attend to that one. And then moving on, as occupational health and safety personnel, we are responsible for ensuring that safety standards are implemented on site. However, many safety measures require financial approval and support from management. How can we effectively enforce and maintain safety compliance when decision-making and budget controls are with our superiors, yet OHS personnel are often the first to be held accountable if an incident or disaster occurs on the construction site? So, Prof, maybe that one, a quick response, and I'm not sure if you do have anything on access control procedures.
Yeah, no, but I think that is actually quite interesting, because remember, we've seen it even with the thing of thinking you can't just hold one person liable, you must bring in the client as well, because you see, if you let one person just be responsible, the other people don't take a lot of these other maybe issues as part of what they should also do or take them seriously. But if I know that, okay, if this contractor will be held accountable, even me as a client, I'll be called in terms of what did I approve, or what is it that I did, what was my role. So you find as a chain, because now it's like a chain reaction thing, then everybody starts working together. And that's why we also even talked about the leadership. So it can't just be the health and safety person who should be held accountable. The leadership, starting from the top, they need the buy-in to see why it makes business sense for us to invest in health and safety, for example, so that then it can come, because we cannot just hold them liable, like you're saying, if the people top have not bought in and they're not doing their work. So that is where we need to be saying, look, maybe we are focusing on just the wrong person. Yes, they've got liability this kind, but how about the person who's the leader and just folded their arms, and yet this is what can happen? So if we bring in those other people as well to make sure they can be held accountable, then everybody starts moving in the same direction that we want to be moving into. And yes, I saw a question on whether we should be making mandatory training for construction supervisors. We need to do that, especially with emergencies, because that's where we're also finding ourselves short. If you haven't got, I mean, even in an aeroplane, when you sit, they do give us that 1 minute training, right? In case of an emergency. I'm not sure how many people understand. Sometimes after it's done, I always ask a question, say, what did you say exactly? But they try to give us that kind of training. In case of this, open the door, do this, do that. So I think, but in this particular case, we need to make it mandatory, because we know what is at risk. Because if you are trained, you can also train others. If you're the one who's in a situation, there should be other people as well around, not just one person. Because if that person is the one maybe mostly affected in it, should everybody just fold their arms? So mandatory training for key people on construction sites for emergency measures needs to be done as well. Who's going to fund? How are we going to fund it? That's another debate. But if we buy in and we all agree it's important, and at the end of the day, it saves lives and it saves money, one or another, direct, indirect cost, I think we should be doing that. Otherwise, we'll be talking, and yet we're still not acting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. I'm just going to allow this one more from Elizabeth as to whether you have a system or process in construction management that integrates OHS and environment that can be benchmarked. Prof, the question is directly a question to yourself.
Oh,
Do you have
what's
such a
the
system?
question?
Does Prof have a system or process in construction management that integrates OHS and environment that we can benchmark?
Okay, at the moment, what I can say is like there are systems that are being developed. Whether that would say this is the standard, I think we still need to work on those. And for the university, like I was saying, even if we don't have it now, if the industry came, we'll have it tomorrow. So all we're saying is we might have things that we just want them to be sharing. If we can share with the industry, reach out to us, see what we have, tell us what your needs are, because sometimes we have to tailor maybe something first for you, or maybe it has to be something that then can be used for everyone. But we do have some systems. It's just a question of if that is the system that you're looking for. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Prof. We're going to end the session, and thank you once again for your wonderful presentation and for the responses. To the delegates, if your questions were not taken, we will look at how perhaps members of our OHS committee could get back to you in terms of some of the items that you have raised. So, ladies and gentlemen, technology is increasing, shaping the future of construction safety, from monitoring systems and digital site management tools to predictive risk analytics. However, we must be cognizant that technology alone cannot solve all our safety challenges. It must be supported by competent professionals, proper training, leadership commitment, and a strong safety culture. And we at that stage of the program now where we need to take a comfort break. And I'm going to actually cut that down to 5 minutes in the interest of time. So please remain logged into the webinar, and we will convene at 11:25 sharp for the panel discussion. I think that's going to be a really interesting session. So thank you, and I will see you all after the 5-minute break. Thank you. Yes, thank you, and welcome once again to all the delegates and speakers as we reconvene the webinar brought to you by Master Builders South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for our panel discussion. And before we begin the panel discussion, I would like to share a short statement often used in safety leadership. Regulations do not prevent accidents, people implementing them do. So South Africa has a strong regulatory framework for construction safety. However, the challenge is not due to the absence of rules, but in ensuring that those rules are consistently implemented on site. And this brings us to our panel discussion on why compliance matters. And joining us today, we have Kobus van Veenkaart, who has a master's degree in business management. He has 20 years experience within the construction industry, and he has served as the national check manager at SAFSEC and is currently the registration manager at SACP CMP. Next up is Hilton Ganesan, who joined the Department of Employment and Labor in 2005, and Hilton is the National Construction Specialist at head office in Pretoria. He holds a BTech degree in engineering and various certificates in OHS and in management. His primary focus is on policy formulation, advocacy, inspection, and enforcement. And finally, we have Dr. Sanjay Munu, who is the Chief Business Development Officer at FEM. Sanjay's distinguished academic achievements include an MBA and PhD qualifications, and he brings a multidisciplinary perspective to leadership, insurance innovation, and risk management. He is a fellow chartered member of SIOSH and a fellow of the New Zealand Institute of Safety Management. So a very warm welcome to our distinguished panelists, and thank you for joining us for what I believe will be a very important discussion. And as we have heard throughout today's sessions, compliance in the construction industry is not simply about meeting regulatory requirements. It is about protecting lives, ensuring accountability, and strengthening the sustainability of our industry. The recent incidents in the construction sector remind us that compliance failures can have devastating consequences. This discussion therefore aims to unpack why compliance matters, what the key challenges are, and what practical steps the industry can take to improve disaster readiness on a construction site. And to kick off the session, I will ask each of our panelists for brief opening remarks, and they can reflect on their area of expertise on why compliance matters. And we're going to begin with Kobus. So Kobus, if you could please join us and speak on common compliance implementation gaps in your opening remarks. Thank you. Over to Kobus.
A very good morning, and thank you very much, Program Director. And thank you very much to Master Builders South Africa for this opportunity to participate in this important discussion today that is really topical and relevant within the construction industry currently. Our recent building collapses, as was mentioned this morning in South Africa, has once again highlighted specifically the critical importance of compliance within the construction industry. While the causes of the incidents are often very complex and subject to the investigations, they keep on reminding us that our construction projects operate within environments where the consequences of failure can really be severe. So South Africa has one of or has a very comprehensive regulatory framework, and that governs the entire built environment. This includes our legislation such as our OSH Act and our construction regulations, and as well as professional regulation through the various acts regulating the industry professionals in ensuring that professionals meet the required standards of competence and professional accountability. So, Chair, also having one of the key challenges that we continue to observe across the industry is not necessarily the absence of regulation, but the gap between our regulatory requirements and the consistent implementation of that on our construction projects. So our common compliance implementation gaps therefore include that appointment of individuals who are not competent to perform the regulated professional functions. Also, compliance being treated as a documentation exercise, as we've heard, rather than an operational practice. And also the late involvement of competent professionals within our construction projects to ensure that the competence is relevant. So these gaps become particularly critical, Chair, when we consider our emergency preparedness and the structural safety, because when systems of oversight, competence and risk management are not effectively implemented, the resilience of the construction projects can therefore be severely compromised. So lastly, discussions such as this one is therefore so important, because improving compliance implementation is not only a regulatory responsibility, but it's a shared responsibility across the entire industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Kobus, for those interesting opening remarks. And I will now move on to Hilton. Hilton will share insights on legislative compliance requirements for construction. Thank you, Hilton.
Thank you, Chair. Again, thank you for having me as well. And it's a pleasure here to be here and obviously answer some questions as well. So from the regulatory point of view, and Prof mentioned it, the chairperson mentioned it, Kobus before mentioned it as well, there's only so much regulations can do. And the chairperson also indicated the importance of implementation. So from the Department of Employment and Labor, you guys do know I'm responsible for the new construction regulations. I'm aiming for it to be out in 2026 or early 2027. But again, that's not going to solve most of our problems. Tightening the regulatory gap is one, but implementation is key. So from when we look at our statistics, one of the biggest problems is on the appointments of the correct person. And the gap that's currently in the legislation is a definition of competent person. And we see that seems to be bent now and again and interpreted in people's own space. But other aspects that we as the Department of Labor inspectors, we do come across is your lack of the lack of risk assessment, lack of conducting audits. There's this perception that the client only conduct audits on a permit site, which is incorrect. All sites should be audited by the client as well. So I don't want to waste too much on time. I'm just dwelling on basic stuff, but implementation of the construction regulations, it's key. I would say it's all day. I would say there's no need for us to even wait for the new one at the revised regulation. National building regulation is also key. Your SANS codes is also key in terms of implementation. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Hilton, for your input, raising some important points, which we'll unpack later on in the panel discussion. And finally, Sanjay, who will reflect on why compliance matters for emergency preparedness and risk management. Over to you, Sanjay.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and very good morning to everyone. So thank you for the opportunity to address an issue that sits at the heart of safety, resilience, and responsible leadership within our industry. The collapse of the building in George was definitely one of the clearest examples of catastrophic failure that caused widespread non-compliance with construction, regulatory, and occupational health and safety standards. So if you look at it holistically from a South African construction sector, as FEM, we provide workmen's compensation cover to just over 7,000 employees and over 300,000 employees in the construction industry. Yet we see on average from 2009 to 2024, an average of 74 fatalities per year. thousands of permanent disabilities. So our workers are facing daily exposure to falls from heights, struck by incidents, excavation collapses, electrical hazards, and dangerous substances, and all well documented, especially when engaging with occupational health and safety specialists who emphasize the hazardous environment in which our construction workers operate. And yet, despite the decades of legislation and industry efforts, South Africa continues to experience a disproportionate and high number of construction-related fatalities and injuries. And these risks make one thing very clear, is that we cannot afford to treat emergency preparedness as a tick box exercise. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sanjay. Indeed, it shouldn't be a tick box exercise. Thank you for that interesting submission. Ladies and gentlemen, we often find that the regulatory framework in South Africa is quite comprehensive. However, the challenge often lies in translating these requirements into practical implementation on construction sites. So let's hear from our panelists this morning on their thoughts as to why the gap between regulatory requirements and practical implementation still exists in the construction industry. Sanjay?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So as FEM, we take health and safety very seriously, and that's one of the areas that I'm responsible for. And, the sad part of it is when, I travel to the George building collapse and you see that the number of bodies being pulled up from site, it does send a very strong message across. When you see the dependents coming through to our offices quite regularly as well, quite helpless as well because they've lost a breadwinner in the family and a loved one. It definitely sends the message across. So what we have done is initiated a number of projects aimed at addressing the non-compliance within the construction sector. So in fact, when I go to a board subcommittee as well, I do report on this and in terms of the non-compliance. So we have a construction health and safety committee at FEM where we get industry bodies. The MBAs are quite prominent on this committee, the health and safety practitioners from the MBAs. And of course, we look at the level of compliance. And what you would see, of course, is because the industry is quite massive, right? You're looking at around 700,000 individuals in the formal sector, another probably 300,000 in the informal sector. So it's quite vast, not like mining where you quite have a very densely located entities. So construction is all over the country. You don't have any barriers to entry as well. So if you're a teacher, you can get into construction. What we also find is that the level of compliance is much higher within the developed areas. So your Durban, Joburg, and Cape Town. When you go into the rural areas, you have a high number of SMMEs as well operating who have very limited level of compliance in terms of health and safety. And looking at it, we're saying, all good and well to have compliance, but when you're looking at an SMME who's in dire straits from a profitability perspective or just trying to earn a living, health and safety is not top of mind for them. So I think what's key is ensuring that these events like conferences, these webinars, training is very critical as well. So I think that's sort of our observation from a compliance perspective. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Sanjay. I think also the point you touch on resonates with the partnership between FEM and the Master Builders Associations and perhaps other organizations in terms of the delivery of health and safety mentorship programs. Would you like to just maybe say something around that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So I think definitely what we've identified, of course, is the deficiency in terms of the training that's available for SMMEs, and in partnership with the MBAs, the MBSA as well, we've rolled out an FEM mentorship program. So we encourage employees, if you have any SMMEs that could benefit, so please do send us the details and we can refer to the MBAs. And I think it's going to make a huge difference. I think last year we looked at the numbers, around 113 individuals were mentored. So yeah, and I think you have this sort of cross-pollination, right? So if you have one subcontractor moving from site to site, they're able to even engage with the main contractor and share best practice, because they are going to be quite key in terms of driving health and safety on site. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Kobus, any thoughts from your side on the gap?
Yes, most certainly. So Chair, with regards to some of the compliance issues is where that gap exists, because compliance gets treated as a documentation process rather than a practice. We see that gap in the industry where there's the tendency sometimes to ensure that, okay, the documentation has been done, we are ready for the audit, but we've got the beautiful safety files in the safety office that racks up office space, and we've got these risk assessments developed, method statements, everything, the documentation is there. But when it comes to that effectiveness of these documents and how they are actually implemented on the actual construction projects, and how actively involved the people that are doing the work is to ensure that these risks that have been identified, how are they being mitigated? The emergency plans that has been developed, how practical are they? And can they be, at the time when an emergency hits, can they be actively engaged and, actually be rolled out the way that the plan envisaged it to be able to be rolled out? So growth from the industry, and as from a regulatory perspective as well, compliance systems must therefore function as operational tools and not, and that's specifically for the risk management and not simply to be administrative documentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kobus. And Hilton, what are the views of the department around this gap?
Thank you, Chair. So Sanjay and Kobus did cover a part of my response as well. So let's look at the last few disasters. And let's look at George, and we look at the one in Gauteng, the one that happened a few weeks ago. And it shows the gap there. So we're always going to have that element of, I would say, illegal activities. That's one that need to be identified as well by our professionals. And then when you have a fully good site, I would say, let's just use a site like Sanjay mentioned, either in Cape Town, Gauteng, or KZN, that's got a permit, got an agent, and stuff like that. There, the issue is still implementation. And from the Department of Labor notices and our statistics, the issues on those sites is actually with the subcontractors and the subbies of the subbies. So that's where most of our notices are, most of the non-compliances are identified. Lastly, when it comes back to the site that happened here in Armando, that I'm gonna not dwell too much on the legislative part, because a lot of stuff that obviously it was beyond us in terms of legislation. We all know the plan itself was not approved. I myself drove into the site and I couldn't even park there because there's a big pylon, a huge electrical pylon in the site itself. So one can wonder many things, what went wrong there. But the issue or the only advice I can give is it's us on the ground and people and your members as well to just identify and report these as professional individuals as well, so that we can be aware of such activities going on. So that gap between regulatory and practical, it will always be there. Safety culture, utmost importance, and one cannot be, alluded to that the notion about cost as well. People obviously will bypass the legislative requirements to save costs. So that's something that's known, and we have to also talk about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of those insights. So what we're hearing already is that compliance is not just about legislation, it is about competence, it is about accountability, and it's also about culture on construction sites. So professional competence and registration does play a critical role in construction safety. So Kobus, from the SACP CMP perspective, how important is professional accountability in preventing site disasters? And how does the SACP CMP execute its mandate in this regard?
Thank you very much, Chair. So as indicated, the appointment of competent practitioners within the built environment and on our construction sites are of utmost importance. And one of the most significant compliance gaps that we also realize is within the construction industry actually relates to individuals performing regulated functions without being competent. So from the industry perspective, individuals are sometimes appointed to roles such as construction managers, project managers, health and safety practitioners, basically because they are available, not because they are competent. And some of them are just because they're available and they are in and around the area. But however, from the SACP CMP's perspective, project and construction management, according to the PCMP Act 48 of 2000, clearly stipulates which professions are required to be registered, of which our project and construction managers play such an important role to ensure that the decisions that are made on projects are done so by competent professionals that has got the relevant experience and the knowledge to ensure that the proper systems are put in place to prevent these severe incidents from taking place on our projects. As the council, how do we enforce our mandate? The council is actively engaging with departments such as Department of Employment and Labour, together with their inspectorate, and as well as with our voluntary associations such as MBSA and all the other MBAs and other voluntary associations such as SIRE, to drive the professionalization and to communicate to the public out there that professionalization should not be an administrative burden. It is part of your risk management process to ensure that those people that are doing the work on site or making the critical safety related decisions are competent to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Kobus. That highlights the important role that professional registration and accountability play in strengthening compliance within the industry. And of course, another key dimension of compliance is enforcement. So Hiltons, perhaps you are best placed to advise us that from an enforcement point of view, what are the most common compliance failures that inspectors encounter on construction sites? And what steps do you think could be taken to mitigate these failures?
Thank you, Chair. So the most common construction notices that we issue three types of notices, which is the prohibition notice, we stop all work immediately, a contravention notice where we give you time up to 60 days, and an improvement notice where the inspector uses his power on something that's not legislated. Now, the prohibition notice is one of the most common notices we issue mainly to subcontractors. So our issue in the industry is subby of a subby. And last year, 2025, the Department of Employment and Labour, together with the ILO, the International Labour Organization, we conducted a project to conduct inspections around the country on subcontractors particularly. So for that project, we eliminated the client and the principal contractor. And we actually issued more notices than the inspections itself, meaning that we issued multiple notices to sites. Common non-compliance is no risk assessment, no appointment of a designer, no appointment of a client, having somebody to do the audits, and so forth. So remember, the reprisal is if the client appoints a PC, the client appoints the PC. If the PC appoints a subcontractor, the PC appoints the subcontractor. Likewise, with the subby appointing the subby, they have to be auditors as well. Then Sanjay did cover working on heights. Very common notices we issue when working on heights, especially on scaffolding, working on ladders and so forth. No safety harness, no medical fitness certificates, no risk assessment pertaining to that as well. So those are the very common notices that we issue from the Department of Labour. And the particular project that we did last year with the ILO on the subby of the subby, there was a lot of sites that they did not notify us. You know that you have to notify the department on the prescribed Annexure 2. And when we go on site, we find that obviously we were not notified. And to add more on that project was really, we let the inspectors drive around and basically go to sites randomly, or we call those proactive inspections. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that. I think it's very insightful, and it reminds us that many compliance failures are often not due to lack of regulations, again reinforcing that it's a lack of implementation or oversight. Another aspect that is often very revealing comes from the risk and insurance environment, where incidents and claims provide valuable lessons. So Sanjay, from the risk and insurance side, I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate on what patterns emerge in construction incidents and claims, and what lessons should the industry be learning from these experiences?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, yeah, it's quite vast, and I think it's going to get a bit more difficult with the COID amendments that's about to be, well, they've been assented into law. We're just reviewing that at the moment. But certainly from a penalty perspective, where if you report, if you're not compliant, you're not reporting your claims on time, there's going to be a penalty of 10%. If so the level of compliance is, yeah, from a COIDA perspective, is becoming an issue, and especially what we're seeing a growing trend at FEM, and been in discussions with the compensation fund and with Rand Mutual as well, is the number of employees who are not complying in terms of the COID Act by not submitting the return of earnings. We've seen an increase of that at FEM. The other would be the issue, especially looking at, for example, the George incident, where many of those deceased were individuals from foreign countries. And if you do not have the proper documentation, it makes it very difficult to then process the claim. So in terms of the COID Act, you need to provide a certified copy of your ID. So that's very important to get identification of that employee. And if we don't have that, then unfortunately we can't proceed with processing the claim. So it's quite a challenge from that perspective. And looking at the cost as well, right? So what we've seen is, for example, where there's a permanent disability that's been awarded to an employee where the severity is between 1 and 30%. In terms of Schedule 4 now, the minimum compensation or the minimum lump sum is going to be just over 100,000 Rand. So it's making it very much more costly from a loss ratio perspective for insurers. And then ultimately what will happen if there's an increase in terms of the loss ratios, then it makes it difficult to keep the tariff rates low. We might have to increase the tariff rates. The other aspect would be from a rebate perspective, which we pay out to employers, there would be a loss of that. There would be potential loading of the tariffs as well if the loss ratios exceed a certain threshold. So we have mechanisms which we can ensure compliance from a COIDA perspective. Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that, Sanjay. I think what becomes clear is that many incidents are in fact preventable when compliance is embedded into everyday site practice. And that brings us to an important distinction that is often discussed in the industry. So I think Kobus referred to this. We often hear about paper compliance versus real compliance. And this is open to any of the panelists to respond on what practical steps the contractors can take to ensure that compliance becomes part of daily site practice rather than just a documentation exercise. So we have this, that where we say that paper compliance versus real compliance, but what are the practical steps then that, if we understand that that is the problem, what are the practical steps that can be taken to assist our contractors? Anyone would like to take that one? Hilton? Or Kobus, yeah?
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Chair. I think it comes down to, and Chair, you've mentioned it previously as well, how do we ensure that compliance actually drives through from just being a paper-driven exercise? It comes down to the compliance culture and the industry awareness. Because it's a very broad challenge that relates to the entire compliance culture within our entire industry. Our compliance is viewed primarily as a regulatory obligation. And a lot of our organizations mainly focus just meeting the minimum requirements. However, where compliance is really integrated into the project's governance, our professional accountability of those registered professionals that we spoke about, that's supposed to be acting according to their code of conduct and to act ethically, as well as the organizational culture. We know, we've heard a lot about organizational cultures and health and safety culture programs, but projects tend to achieve a stronger safety outcome and an improved operational performance if that organizational culture is aligned with the compliance part of regulation. So professional regulation and registration through all of our built environment councils supports this culture by ensuring that those practitioners, as I've indicated, that meet the competency standards are then subject to that professional code of conduct that they need to comply with and act ethically. Thank you.
Thank you. Hilton, do you want to add, or are you covered?
Just one point, and thanks, Chairperson. So on the chat, I noticed a lot of comments and a lot of remarks about tick box exercise. Even the last comment says just because someone has book knowledge does not mean they are passionate about what they do as health and safety. And I do agree with these comments as well. And one of the challenges we have is that any construction site, it will start from the client, and you'll know that the most important aspect from the client side is to compile a baseline risk assessment and a health and safety specifications. And that basically runs from A to Z on the site. Now, as much as I indicated, I agree with most of the comments and so forth. Remember, you have to have this portion of a theoretical or a book exercise. This baseline risk assessment, this health and safety specs, it runs throughout the project. So remember, this have to be implemented. And we can argue that it's just a tick box exercise, have the health and safety file on site and so forth. But if it's done correctly and implemented correctly, then we will have a good compliance and we'll have less incidents. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you for that. I think we've got some very practical suggestions here, and they highlight that compliance must ultimately translate into behavior and preparedness on the ground. And when incidents do occur, the speed and effectiveness of the initial response can make a significant difference. So can any of you share your thoughts on what every construction site should ideally have in place to ensure effective emergency response and preparedness?
Chair, is that for me?
Any of you, if you're happy to take that one. So what should the construction site ideally have in place to ensure effective emergency response and preparedness?
Okay, I'll just touch on that for now. Chair, this is a very broad topic, and the Prof also covered quite an aspect of it. Remember, we're also talking an element of the Disaster Management Act as well. And then you're also talking an element of the National Disaster Management Framework Act. Like if we look at that act as well, that basically was an act that stays dormant and it get evoked by the municipality. Like for George, that act was evoked, implemented. Obviously, all those costs involved in recovering of the George collapse, it had to come from somewhere, some legislation, some act. And one might ask, well, fine, the site was cleared, but how did it get cleared, and how did who bear the cost? So that's where the Disaster Management Act come in, and the National Disaster Management Framework policy comes in as well. So we have to be mindful of that. And as I indicated, it's a very broad topic. If you look at the construction regulations, only under Construction Regulation 9, they'll talk about an emergency plan, and that's very limited to fire. So that's a space that we don't want to go too much into the construction regulation. While it's a draft phase, I am getting recommendations. Let's put something into that aspect. And obviously, it's a TC that makes the final decision, but it's not really practical. I saw a comment on the chat chair earlier around in the day, and they said, whoa, I'm crossing my fingers. I hope they don't implement this in the construction regulation. Assessing the risk through a baseline risk assessment or IRA is already so cumbersome in terms of assessing every risk. And we're going to move that over to the health and safety framework to assess your national disaster or something like a collapse. That is something that we have to also consider, where the local municipality comes in, and if it classifies as a national disaster, then the national management framework comes in. So, Chair, in essence, I would say that we as construction professionals will have to also be mindful of these disasters and emergency preparedness plan in relation to your National Disaster Management Act as well. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. Just to follow up, I mean, should there not be more emphasis on an emergency plan for actual structural collapses? I mean, do construction companies actually have a plan for structural collapses, how to deal with it? You spoke about fire, but shouldn't that be something that we should start considering and enforce? Hilton?
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yeah, that is a valid question. Now, let's look at the last collapse, the one in Gauteng, and I'm busy with that. And we got a motion in place that we want to obviously get that site demolished. Now, the moment that that incident happened, if you look at the collapse itself at the time it happened, and I'm going to say this on a public platform, there's nobody on that site, whether it was the permit site, whether you had an agent, whether you had a professional that's competent enough to make sure that you can demolish or remove that site in sequence the way it's supposed to be removed, those slabs, without having a possibility risk of injuring somebody else. So we have to take that into consideration. Now, in order for us to get that demolition done, it's still, we require a demolition company to come and give us a risk assessment, give us a method statement, exactly how the demolition will be done, the sequence and stuff. So we have to consider that part of the aspect as well. I know your question is mainly focused on the actual disaster, when it happened, ASAP, what needs to be done. Remember that implementation, we cannot say, let's put it in the risk assessment. We can broadly accommodate if a scaffolding falls, if a construction slab falls, if a beam starts to bend, we can accommodate that in our risk assessment. But you also want to also do not overarch or go out of our mandate and also step into an emergency prepared plan that can have other unintended consequences. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Hilton. And I think clearly disaster readiness requires planning, training, and coordination across multiple stakeholders. And this brings us to the broader question of industry collaboration. So looking ahead, maybe Sanjay, can you perhaps tell us how our industry bodies, the regulators, the professionals, and contractors can collaborate more effectively to strengthen disaster readiness and compliance within the construction sector? I also know that FEM is also part of Construction Alliance South Africa, and I've heard earlier that the president of Construction Alliance South Africa is on this webinar, and that's a collaborative body. But in that spirit, are there any suggestions that you could perhaps put on the table?
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, that's absolutely important. I think, from a South African perspective, we're quite fortunate that we have, I think, excellent industry bodies, and looking at it from a COVID perspective as well, that gave us the headway in terms of emergency preparedness, right? And I think that's where the industry got together, and Construction Alliance South Africa as well, who you mentioned now, was quite instrumental in terms of driving compliance within the construction industry, and not just looking at it. Construction is quite a vast sort of stakeholders who are involved and quite critical. Working closely with the Department of Employment and Labour is going to be quite key as well. I think they have their limitations in terms of the number of inspectors, but we're seeing that there's going to be some important announcements going to be made in terms of bolstering their ability to ensure that there's going to be compliance. So I think, how do we engage with them, and then looking at it across the different, from architects to the consulting engineers as well, which is going to be quite key. Looking at it from a construction, we've seen these disasters happening, and you hear the talk, when is the next one going to happen, and when is the next one going to happen? You talk often about lagging indicators versus leading indicators, and certainly what we could see it coming across very evidently from the stats that we have at FEM is that the common cause of accidents, whether it's struck by fall from heights, motor vehicle accidents is quite key as the highest cause of fatalities, and we're seeing it often 15 to 17,000 people per year dying on the roads as well, which is it's extremely high. And you talk about construction, you engage with the contractors. I think it's important to go down to the ground level as well to see the constraints that they are faced with. The time pressures that you hear often being presented, the lack of awareness from the construction work as well, and what we find from our statistics is that you would see a lot of the fatalities are within the younger age groups of between 20 and 30, right? So that gives you an indication that individuals are coming into the workforce and really unaware of the risks that are present within the construction sector, the level of desperation as well for work, so individuals will take on higher risks, and that's where you see fatalities occurring as well. I mean, when we were at the George incident, and you speak to people, and you would hear that there were individuals who were quite experienced, and about a day or two before then, and this is just my observation, right? So they could feel the tremors in the building, and those individuals decided not to come back the next day to work because they feared for their safety, and I think those individuals were spared, right? So it's quite important. Using technology is going to be quite key. As FEM, we've understood that, and if you look at it, about 80% based on studies of all accidents are as a result of unsafe behavior. And creating that awareness is going to be quite important, influencing the culture as well. So we're coming up with a prevention program, which we're going to use WhatsApp as a e-learning mechanism to provide that and incentivize workers as well. So we're doing quite a bit from an FEM perspective, but I think definitely getting all of the role players together, and we don't want to get to the next building collapse and when you're going to have another sort of engagement. I think it requires action, which is quite key. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. It is key to be proactive. Kobus, would you like to weigh in on this? Because I know the SACP CMP does a number of roadshows as well. So any thoughts on collaboration in the sector?
Yes, no, thank you very much, Jay. I think when it comes to collaboration, it is of real utmost importance. Collaboration must be between the regulators and all the industry bodies. In order for us to ensure effective compliance in our construction industry, we really require a strong collaboration between the regulatory bodies as well as the industry organizations such as Master Builders South Africa as well, together with entities as FEM that's doing a lot of work in the construction space as well. So collaboration for the SACP CMP it's working together will help actually that our regulatory expectations that we place on the industry are better understood, as well as is better practically implemented across our industry. So it allows for the sharing of knowledge and best practices between the entities. And it will also allow us to strengthen our professional competence through these partnerships that we establish. And by improving this awareness of our regulatory responsibilities, this will help to strengthen our emergency preparedness across the industry as well, to alleviate and also to prevent these incidents from taking place, because we are sharing information to the people on the ground doing the work. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that input, and thanks to all the panelists for those significant discussions. Before we conclude, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly wrap up with closing remarks. And perhaps when you do that, if you could also share one key action that the construction industry should prioritize to improve disaster readiness on construction sites. If we just go in this order, let's start with Hilton, followed by Sanjay and Kobus, please, your closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So closing remarks is compliance. Remember, regulatory framework and implementation, and collaboration was covered now. But on collaboration, I just want to highlight the importance of the collaboration also right down to the employees themselves, especially to the unions, organized labor, and stuff like that. So I'm busy on a project to ensure that collaboration is done specifically to the client on its own, to the PC, and then to the employees with a very specific subject of subbies, basically the no skills employees, so to speak. So key aspect to ensure readiness, emergency readiness, the Prof did cover that as well. It should be covered under your element of your baseline risk assessment, emergency contact responses. Remember, anywhere in South Africa, your emergency contact numbers for disaster management, local municipality, and so forth, it had to be readily available. Construction regulations are very limited when it comes to emergency readiness plan for disasters, as I indicated under Construction Regulation 9. The most you'll get out of there is on your fire protection plan or your fire emergency plan. And yeah, that's something that we can look at on the draft to maybe just extend that scope as well. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So in the South African construction sector, where risks are high, the stakes are significant, and the consequences of failure are severe, compliance is the foundation of readiness. I would like to mention a comment from my colleague Bronwyn, who's online, and she's recommended standardization, which is going to be quite key in terms of disaster management. And in closing, when we comply, we protect workers. When we comply, we protect projects. And when we comply, we protect our industry. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chair. Can I proceed?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Kobus.
Thank you. In closing, as mentioned by Mr. Gunnison and Mr. Manu, our recent incidents in our construction sector has really highlighted an important reminder that the systems governing our construction safety, as well as our professional accountability, they all exist for a reason. Legislation and the regulatory frameworks that we are provided serve as the foundation for our safe and responsible construction practices. But it also ensures that the effectiveness of our frameworks ultimately really depend on how they are implemented. As we indicated, it should not just be a paper-driven exercise. And that is really ensure in strengthening our compliance within our construction environment. It really requires the collaboration that we touched on between us, regulators, the clients, the contractors, but importantly, our professional practitioners out there as well. And that is to ensure, number one, competence, accountability, and to ensure that risk management that we all know is one of our key aspects is consistently prioritized throughout our project lifecycle. And I want to say the entire lifecycle, because it starts from stage 1 all the way to stage 6, from the initiation stages to closeout. So if there's one key takeaway from this discussion for me, it's that organizations must ensure that competent professionals are involved in our construction projects from the earliest planning stages, and to ensure that compliance systems are actively implemented on our sites rather than it being treated as an administrative burden or just an administrative requirement because a piece of paper said so. So by embedding the compliance part of within our project governance, as well as our professional practice, we can therefore strengthen our emergency preparedness that we touched on today. And that is also to improve our safety outcomes to contribute to a more resilient and a more responsible construction industry. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, thank you to the panelists for that profound discussion. It's been quite an enlightening session, and we now move into the Q&A session. So please type your questions in the chat function. I am going to actually begin with some questions that are already here. I saw one about whether the FEM mentorship program has a cost attached to it. The answer is actually no. So please contact your closest Master Builders Association, and they could assist you with the FEM mentorship program as well. I see one here, interesting question. They say that that we have all the resources and information available. Government wants clients and contractors to comply, yet government is not assisting as much as other countries like the USA, Australia, and UK, where they not only make it easy to retrieve the relevant legislation, but they also provide info, guidance, and certain standards at no cost. So I think, Hilton, this one's for you. Is there any indication of government taking steps to improve its contribution?
Thank you, Chair. So I understand where that question is coming from as well. There's two parts there. The question makes relevance to getting information and the lack of available information as well. So in terms of the UK standard, and what differs from the South African standard is that they may have access to their codes, and that is an issue we have in South Africa as well. You cannot have access to your SANS code or SABS codes. I know they are quite pricey as well. And at some stage, we did engage with the Department of Trade and Industry. They're the body for the codes on making that readily available or freely available on our website. But we basically didn't succeed in that. When it comes to other legislation, it's our own OSH Act regulations and stuff. All of that is free and freely available on our website. You can download those regulations at no cost. When it comes to incidents and lessons learned, we do have some limitations now with the POPI Act, and we can't publish all our findings when it comes to inspectors' reports. I understand that the construction industry obviously want to learn from these as well. So our hands are a bit tied. But when we do these collaborations and roadshows and stuff, we do present on odd lessons learned, odd contraventions found, and to mitigate that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Hilton. Kobus, one of the concerns relates to individuals who have exceeded their candidate period. What is your plan regarding candidates who have been in the candidate phase for an extended period? And they're also saying that in many cases, candidate agents and candidate managers continue to act in the capacity of agents. However, they may never meet the requirements to formally register as an agent. And also some candidates have been in the candidate stage for far too long, or far longer than the prescribed period, yet there appears to be no requirement for them to progress to the next level or to be downgraded if they do not meet the necessary requirements. There's quite a number of things in that. If you could give us brief responses. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And the SACPCMP actually addressed that in the release of our rules for registration in August last year, whereby the requirement is that a candidate can henceforth only be a registered candidate for a maximum of 7 years. So if a candidate does not upgrade or enhance his registration to the professional category, that after 7 years, that person will lose their candidate registration and will not be able to re-register as a candidate. They'll have to register as a professional. So there is a time frame and the requirements are there. So that is definitely addressed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Hilton, another one for you. One of the concerns coming through is that many labor inspectors do not appear to have the necessary training and experience to effectively enforce health and safety requirements. And these safety officers are often put into a position where they have to act as health and safety agents. And how does the department plan to address and manage the situation? Because they have to ensure proper enforcement and oversight.
Thank you, Chair. So there's two parts here. One is made reference to the inspectors' competency, and the second part is made reference to on the site where the CSO is obviously acting for the agent. I just wanted to get that right. So inspectors as well, there is a shortage of inspectors. You guys can even Google it. And I think Sanjay Okobus mentioned during the president's speech, they committed to employing 10,000 more inspectors. So that can show the shortage of inspectors we have on site, and they cannot obviously reach every site. So in terms of the competency for construction inspectors specifically, it's a very small number that we have, and those requirements for inspectors coming in has been revised accordingly for a construction inspector, the construction management, civil, and so forth. So the competency, we did beef them up. It was a challenge previously, but for all new inspectors, I would say appointed from about 2014, we did make the requirements a bit more stringent and more relevant to what's been on site. The second part of that same question was on the CSO, if I heard this correctly, Chair, also gets to act as a client's agent. So I'm not sure in the context of what. Remember, there's two aspects here. A client's agent represents the client. Let's talk about a permit site. And I'm assuming your question is based on the CSO probably have to fill up or close that gap or probably do the audits on behalf of that agent on the site, if I'm getting this question correctly. So in that cases, we are aware of that. There are situations that's happening where the agent gets a permit, is responsible for the site, and then the CSO is the one that's actually basically implementing and doing audits on site. Now, that is totally incorrect. And I don't want to tap into the registration criteria and the scope of qualifications or scope of work under SACPCMP. The reason why the client was issued with the permit or why the client is issued with a construction work permit is obviously based on his professional registration, which was already assessed by SSCPCMP, and having a construction health and safety officer on that site implement the audit and do the checks on that site. That is not accepted. And obviously, that's something that we have to look at, or if it's reported, we'll have to obviously take measures to ensure that does not happen. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Hilton. In the interest of time, I'm just taking one last question, and this is an interesting one. Does the panel think the increasing building collapse are linked to fragmentation between design, accountability, contractor competence, and/or site supervision? And how can existing regulatory compliance and professional bodies strengthen accountability? I think we have touched on some of the questions, but just to wrap this one up, any thoughts on this question? How do we deal with the fragmentation between design, accountability, contractor competence, and all of that? Is this not about leadership and about collaboration?
Chair, if I could.
Yes, please.
So, Chair, I think it has a lot to do with, on a lot of projects, there's not a clear indication of the roles and responsibilities during roles and responsibilities during the 6 life cycle stages of the specific competent persons that are supposed to make critical decisions on projects. I think ensuring that the roles and responsibilities are clearly identified within our various bodies, the different contractors that we get on site, because we get the roles and responsibilities of the regulators, the clients, the contractors, the suppliers, etc. All of them have got roles and responsibilities, and there's sometimes there's not a clear distinction between that, and that causes overlap and confusion. So I believe that if the roles and responsibilities are very well clearly identified, especially by those professionals that needs to practice within the industry, in terms of ensuring that the health and safety of our people on our projects are taken into consideration from the beginning of the planning stages of our projects, I think that will assist to alleviate between that the different phases and the different aspects that takes place on the construction projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Kobus. And ladies and gentlemen, today's dialogue has highlighted a central theme of this webinar, the need to move from policy to practice. South Africa has a strong regulatory framework, but their true impact lies in how they are implemented. So the challenge before us as an industry is therefore not only to understand the rules, but to ensure that they are actively applied in the planning, management, and execution of every project. Thank you to the esteemed panel for helping us unpack this significant issue. We now move to the final segment of today's webinar, and it is my honor to invite Mark Fugard, the Vice President of Master Builders South Africa, to deliver the closing remarks. Mark is an experienced building industry professional with a career spanning more than 40 years. He is the owner of Fugard Consulting, offering services in development, project, and construction management. Please welcome Mark Fugard.
Thank you, Program Director, and good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As we come to the end of today's webinar, I would like to extend Master Builders South Africa's sincere appreciation to all our speakers and participants for contributing to such an important and insightful discussion. Firstly, I would like to thank Roy Manisi for opening today's session and for setting the tone for this engagement. Our gratitude also goes to Richard Bienica and Prof. Kihilo Kajimo Shakantu for their valuable presentations on disaster readiness and the role that technology and resources play in strengthening our preparedness within the built environment. Thanks also goes to our panelists, Kobus van Wijngaard, Hilton Gunnison, and Dr. Sanjay Manu, for unpacking the critical issues of compliance and highlighting why it matters, not only from a regulatory perspective, but also from a safety and sustainability standpoint. A special word of appreciation must go to our program director, Vikashni Harbajan, for guiding us through today's program so efficiently and professionally, and ensuring that the discussion flowed smoothly. Today's discussions have reinforced a very important message, and I took 3 C's out of our discussion, and the first C is compliance. It's absolutely important, as our speakers have explained. The next C was collaboration, and everyone needs to be collaborative and engaged in doing what we need to do to ensure that our preparedness is there, but it fundamentally starts at the beginning of what health and safety needs to provide on our building sites. And the other C was culture. And regarding culture, this must include health and safety becoming a non-negotiable in everything we do in the built environment. And all of this is about protecting lives, safeguarding our infrastructure, and ensuring that the construction industry operates responsibly and sustainably. As the construction sector continues to grow and evolve, the collaboration between industry bodies, one of the C's, between the industry bodies, our regulators, our professionals, our contractors remains essentially. But what's also needed, and was mentioned through the course of today's webinar, is, call it the client bodies, or the bodies that are the givers of work. It's important that they are part of our conversations and part of that collaboration. Platforms such as this webinar allow us to share knowledge, address challenges, and work collectively towards safer and more resilient construction practices. So on behalf of Master Builder South Africa, I would like to thank all participants for taking the time to join us today. Your engagement and interest demonstrates the industry's commitment to improving standards and strengthening compliance. And I thank you once again for your participation. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for those inspiring closing remarks. And ladies and gentlemen, today's webinar has indeed provided important insights into disaster readiness, compliance, and safety leadership in the construction industry. But perhaps the most important message emerging from today's discussions is that disaster readiness is not a document. It is a culture. It requires a leadership, commitment, professional accountability, strong regulatory compliance, investment in training and technology, and constant vigilance on every construction site. As we conclude today's webinar, I would like to leave you with a call to action. Let us commit to ensuring that we move from policy to practice to improve disaster readiness on construction sites, that risk assessments are meaningful and not routine paperwork, emergency response plans are in place and clearly understood, compliance is embedded in site leadership, and that every person returns home safely from a construction site at the end of each day. Because ultimately, policy only protects lives when it is translated into practice on every construction site. I hope to see all of you at the Master Builder South Africa Annual Congress set for 4th September 2026 at the Zimbali Resort in the beautiful province of KwaZulu-Natal. And remember that safety is the foundation of every structure. Thank you once again. Stay safe and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Yeah.